Very good afternoon and welcome to the November Schools Forum meeting. Can I first of all ask Jo if there are any apologies for absence?
Thanks, Andrew. Apologies received from Peter Hales, Elisa Entwistle, Adam White and David Alexander.
Okay, thank you very much. And before we move on, can I just welcome a new member to Schools Forum, and that's Helen Bond, who's representing the Parent Carer Forum. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you. It's very good to be here. I don't know if you'd like a quick introduction from me.
That would be really good. Yeah, Jo indicated that you might be able to do that. That'd be fabulous. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm here in my official capacity as coordinator for Gloucestershire Parent Carer Forum. Parent carer forums are representative local groups of parent carers who have children and young people with disabilities. We work alongside local authorities, education departments, health and other service providers to ensure that services they plan, commission, deliver and monitor meet the needs of children and families. And that's a direct quote from the SEN Code of Practice. We seek to be the voice of those with lived experience of being a parent carer. And for us, that means parents and carers of children with disability, SEN conditions, impairments or additional needs. So thank you very, very much for welcoming us to be part of this forum. We hope that we will be able to bring real knowledge and experience, lived experience and expertise to work with you over the coming months. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Helen. I look forward to your contribution to Schools Forum, which I'm sure will be really valuable. Jo, back to you, please. Can I ask if there are any declarations of interest?
Received.
No?
No.
Okay, excellent. And any public questions?
None received.
Okay, thank you. Can we then move on to the minutes of the last meeting, which was on 17th of September? Could I first of all just go through them quickly and ask for any issues concerning accuracy that anybody might want to raise? So on page 2 of the printed minutes, which starts with declarations of interest at the top on item 53. So if we start there, anything on that page anybody wants to mention? No. Page 3. Concerning Schools Forum membership, the main part on that page. No, this is for accuracy. Page 4. Page 5. Page 6. Where we went into high needs. Page 7. Page 8. Page 9, which largely is about education capital. Any questions about the accuracy of those minutes? Okay, thank you very much. So we'll take those being a true and accurate record of that last meeting. If we go on now to matters arising, there are 3 actions from the action sheet. So the early years item will come up as an agenda item for this meeting. Schools Forum membership, we've welcomed Helen, so that's dealt with. And Phil is going to provide a verbal update on high needs. So that's the action point, that 3rd action point. Again, we should go through very quickly. Again, if there are any other matters arising that haven't been highlighted yet or flagged up. Page 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9. Okay, thank you very much. So can we therefore move on to the main business of this meeting? So that's where we are going to have an update about COVID, the implications of COVID on schools, the education sector, and also the F40 action on this issue. Phil, I think it's over to you, please.
Yeah, I'm just going to share screen. Just got a couple of slides to go through on this one. wait for the technology to catch up. Right, yeah, so I'm just checking. Can everybody see that now? I lose sight of everybody want to do
It's
it.
good here.
Yeah, great. So yeah, I wanted to provide a kind of update on where we were in relation to some of the activity that's been generated through COVID, and some of the financial implications, and also just to start to get a bit of a collective view and a discussion around, you know, how people are seeing the impact of the pandemic on financial situation in particular, obviously, across this autumn term, since we've lost the access to the exceptional costs. Just a quick update on where the exceptional costs work got to from the DfE end. From a maintained school perspective, we received an additional £228,689 in October. That was for those who had submitted a claim that was within the limit of the 3 standard categories, and for those who had submitted a claim that was above that limit. There was in the initial wave, we received over 440. This is the second element, and they've approved those. The bits that remain outstanding, which schools won't have seen yet, are where there's been claims that are outside of the range of categories that they identified, and the DfE ESFA have said that they're assessing each of those individually, and as it says on the right of that slide, they anticipate being able to inform schools of the outcome within the next 6 weeks. That was dated 21st of October, that update. So we should shortly be getting the completion of that first exercise. So these were the exceptional costs that were incurred in the first phase of the pandemic, from well, effectively March till the end of July. So that kind of gives a bit of an update on where those elements are. As I said at the last forum, and in a kind of range of different fora as well, whenever I can, it is critical for us to continue to keep tracking these costs, and we have through SchoolsNet and I hope through Heads Up Today, kind of asked schools to share with us the kind of the current position in terms of the exceptional costs for term 1 and as we move into term 2 as well. What you can see on the slide there and within the report is kind of what we've received to date. So 50 schools have responded, submitted back in, and those are from a range of different schools. It's not just maintained. That includes academy responses as well. And this covered the term 1 period. And that effectively is telling us those 50 schools have so far incurred somewhere around about £385,000 worth of additional costs. If you build that up to the over 300 schools that are in Gloucestershire, that starts to become a big number. If you then look at that across term 1 and assume similar costs into term 2, term 3, etc., we will start to see quite a big financial impact across the schools in Gloucestershire. The reason we're trying to capture this is because, and I hope that came across in the latest letter from the F40. There's a vehicle there for us to engage directly with the funding team at the ESFA to push for these exceptional costs to be covered, and to continue to be covered across term 1, 2, and until a reasonable point when we can say that the pandemic is not having an increased impact on or a detrimental impact on the financial position of schools across the county. So the reason for asking for this information is to try to build that picture, to be able to give the F40 and the DfE directly through our own links a clear picture of the current financial impact on schools. And as we can see from this, and it is only a small snapshot at this stage, that is quite a significant number. What we have been trying to do through COVID is try to make sure that we're focused on key priority, the key priorities, and certainly from a funding perspective, looking at how we can support some of that. Children and young people struggling to access education and the transition points in education is clearly something that's quite heavily impacted by COVID, the extended period out of school. Transitions obviously in the summer were difficult for those that were moving between different institutions. Very conscious around the impact on staff, mental health and well-being across the education system and the pressures that have been created upon what was already a fairly pressurised system. A real impact there in terms of the pressure on school leaders, teachers, assistants, all school staff across the education staff across the piece. We're trying to maintain a focus around school improvement and performance as well. Obviously, these things don't go away, and I think the Education Outcomes and Intervention team, which Jane Lloyd-Davis leads, is taking a kind of measured approach to trying to continue to support schools that have project groups and that are on that performance journey, trying to balance that and look at a kind of proportionate response given, again, those pressures. And then the final one, which has been coming up more recently, because we're starting to look at schools that are at risk of deficit, is the support that we provide to schools that are either in deficit or at risk of deficit. And we're just effectively launching into a range of meetings post kind of half-year returns with schools around this. And I would welcome views from people around the forum about if there are them around how we might want to approach that given the COVID context and the additional impact that those additional costs are having on particularly schools in the system. In the report we laid out, let's turn back actually a second. In the report we laid out a number of different, a couple of areas where we were providing direct support, particularly around the children and young people struggling to access education and the transition points. So we ran a program which was given a kind of brief overview of, which was supported by Young Gloucestershire, called Transition Chat, which was supporting 100 children and young people that were at risk of becoming NEET, not accessing education, employment or training across the summer, and had really positive success around that kind of engagement. And we commissioned that through some of the additional COVID funding that the local authority received, and are planning to commission that again moving forward for this forthcoming year. We're very conscious that for year 11s in particular, going into a very uncertain period around what exams and etc. are going to look like, that support will be required. And then the second thing, which is outlined in the report, and I think provided a link to the documentation, the operating model for that, was the development of the team around the locality cluster work, which was effectively a multi-agency response, which is now available, is operating. We're receiving referrals with a view to trying to identify those children and young people that are really struggling to access education, that schools are looking for additional support for. Effectively trying to find a way to make sure that we've got that joined up multi-agency conversation that schools can come to, engage with, access the right support from services that already exist and or available, but also look at whether we can identify if needed additional funding to support that as well. And the view there was really that what we didn't want was children and young people coming through the system and entering into the statutory elements of the system, having to access an EHCP, or resulting more likely in permanent exclusion, because they've been out of school for a significant period of time and they were struggling to access education on their return. So we've put those both in place and are funding and supporting those to engage. The other bit to mention, I guess, is around staff mental health and wellbeing. The restorative practice team, which has been commissioned through High Needs, have recently done some work with Gloucester primary heads. I think the 20 heads. They're running a reconnect session for school leaders, and that was really focused around taking a bit of a breath from the pressure that's been upon them throughout this time, and finding a good space to be able to have some of those conversations that maybe you aren't able to have in a day-to-day basis with your own staff. Stepping away and looking at the impact of the pandemic on all parts of the system and the pressure that's created. Those we've been running those across the education service as well, and they're received very well. I know there's a further conversation coming up with Cheltenham primary heads to run something similar. So it's a small sample of the kind of things we've been looking to do. There are other things that are happening. We've announced there's a national program, wellbeing program, which the EP service are running through the Anna Freud Centre, which has been publicised through the Heads Up arrangements, and that is something that's coming to support, particularly focused around the pressures on staff across the again, what's likely to be another extended period of time whilst these pressures remain in the system. So yeah, I was trying to provide that view. The bit that I'm particularly keen to get feedback on now as well is around those schools that are at risk of deficit and the pressures that we're facing in terms of rising deficits. In the January forum, we will report back and give a picture as to where the maintained school system is in terms of current school forecast deficits and plans, and that's going to have a COVID element to it, and it feels uncomfortable to me to be putting schools in a position where they're having to make significant changes and cuts to address financial impacts that are created by the COVID costs that are coming through the system. So I'd be welcome any feedback on that. I'm going to stop there, and I'm not going to stop sharing because I can't see anybody at the moment. So I'll stop sharing and just ask if there's any questions or feedback or thoughts around the pressures in relation to COVID, if there's anything we're missing. The letter that went, which we included from the F40, covered a whole range of areas that they're applying and engaging with government directly about. Are there things that the forum feel that we're missing in this and we need to look to address?
Andrew, we've had a few hands go up. Can I ask people, please use the system and put your hand up there, because we just can't see you on the screen waving your hand. So Chris Spencer, I know you made a comment. Did you want to come in, Chris? With your permission, Andrew.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, which is a very helpful introduction, Phil, to the discussion. While I'm conscious of the additional costs, another significant loss to schools is, of course, particularly our secondary schools and some of our bigger primary and specials, is a loss of income. For some secondary schools, that's amounting to a couple of 100,000 that I know of. There might be some that's more than that, particularly those where they've got service level agreements with sports companies, for example, like Goals Football. That's going to be a significant loss of income. And I know schools budget and count on that. So that's going to be a big loss, I think. That was it. Thanks, Andrew.
You're on mute, Andrew.
Okay, so Phil, did you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, yeah, can do. I think that's a really good point. At the moment, actually, we're tracking the loss of the additional costs. We need to make sure that we're incorporating that into template. So I'll build that in with the finance team and see if we can start to report back on loss of income as well. We will just need to be careful that that's aligned with the kind of the furlough scheme that's available, because what will almost certainly come back is you lost income, but were you able to furlough any staff related to any of that? We just need to make sure that that's squared off as well. But yeah, that's a really good point.
So
Okay.
Andrew, we've got Sarah Murphy and Jackie Phillips have both got their hands up.
Okay, before we go on to Sarah and Jackie, I know Lynn, you said you can't raise your hand. You're on mute as well. If you,
yeah, I'm not getting the logo come up to raise my hand. That's why I'll be waving. I don't know if anyone else has got the same problem. Claire's got the same problem.
if you click on the participants list, then you can raise your hand that way.
Okay.
Yeah, at the bottom of the participants list, there's a raise your hand, and then when you spoke, you can lower it.
Brilliant,
Right,
thank you.
We've got you anyway now. All right.
Okay. Right. So Sarah, you wanted to make a point.
Hello, yeah, as the union representative here, I just wanted to highlight to the forum that I'm already representing staff that are undergoing restructures and redundancies in their schools. So that's already coming through as casework to me, and it's quite unusual for that to be happening this term. It's normally a spring, summer term phenomena. I'm also seeing a significant increase in really quite complex and serious casework. So a lot of suspensions and formal capabilities are heading in my direction. And I absolutely agree with your concerns over the issues around mental health. So you can imagine literally hundreds of emails that I get from staff members and have done over the last few months, particularly when there's a new government announcement and new rules that we all have to follow. Prior to the summer holidays, that was anxieties over health and sort of physical health and risk assessments. Now the greater concern is over workload. So staff having to do blended learning and be teaching students both in the classroom and at home, and the use of technology in the classroom. So I'd like the forum to recognise the massive impact on workload that these unusual conditions are having for teachers and support staff. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Can I just ask about a couple of things you said? You mentioned suspensions and capability and the increase in that caseload. Is that connected to COVID?
One of the suspensions I've got is related to COVID. I mean, I could get a bit political here, and I'm sure many of the head teachers here would disagree with me, but my observation is often capability is used as a way to try and nudge someone out of a school. It often isn't, but sometimes from my perspective it seems to be. So I'm finding people are being moved rapidly through what some heads are calling support plans. I might say that they're not, but through the support plan process and straight onto formal capability. And as you'll all be aware, no teacher wants to be on formal capability because it's then on their record. So yeah, it is. A lot of it is finance related, I would suggest, more than COVID related. I am getting some casework where teachers are their remote lessons are being observed, and that's triggering support plans, which is, that's really a difficult one to address. So it's lots of casework and complex casework.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Jackie, you wanted to make a point?
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, one of the slides of the presentation has been on exceptional costs, and I note that quite obviously cleaning and premises, free school meals, etc., is going to be very high on the list. This idea of additional work for staff through blended teaching, remote lessons, and students' health and welfare, and perhaps not being in attendance physically in school for a whole variety of reasons, there is an associated additional cost for IT to the schools. That doesn't appear to be captured, and if it is in the other bucket, I would suggest that the figures are going to be very low there, or the low figures represented there will not cover it. So can we be assured that the IT position, both in schools And as a network for the entire county, is it sufficient? Are we going to incur additional costs? And if so, what are those costs and how do we capture them? Because going forward, I don't think the IT situation is going to resolve itself.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Phil, do you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, sure. So the categories identified were the ones identified by the department as part of the process for claiming exceptional costs. So they identified the three core areas where they saw exceptional costs coming into the system, and then allowed for people to apply for other costs. I agree with Jack entirely. One of the messages we're getting at the moment is that there is, for some schools, a need to invest quite heavily in the IT infrastructure, particularly where over the years you would say there's been pressure on school budgets, and that one of the things that's easier to cut and to not do is replace ICT equipment, because you'd rather do that than reduce headcount, staffing, or increase contact time, etc. So you can see that the years of pressures have created probably a system that isn't as IT friendly as it currently needs to be to deliver what we're aiming to. So it's a really good point. I think in the way that we're capturing costs, I think moving forward we could actually identify that as a separate item if you felt that was worthwhile.
I get the impression that that's something which there are certainly costs, particularly with blended learning and so on. So perhaps it would be worthwhile including that. Okay. Does anybody else want to make any other points about exceptional costs related to COVID?
But David Metcalf, and did Lynn say she was struggling to speak as well? Okay, David.
Thank you, Andrew. I suppose it's perhaps one that may rear its head in the near future, and that's the recruitment and retention. So it's not quite exceptional costs right now, but I think I can foresee a patch of really big churn amongst staff, head teachers. I wonder how many are sort of hanging on at the moment to see their schools through the current crisis, who may have perhaps moved. And I think that will perhaps shift a lot of school budgets in all sorts of different directions in different ways. And I wonder if anything's been thought about in that area.
I mean, I guess that's something we just, in a way, have to wait and see what happens. But Phil, I don't know if there's any planning that you'd be thinking for that.
It's an interesting one. That one, I can see that the impact of COVID will create pressures that might create turnover and churn in the system. Just from a previous role, I did quite a lot of work around this because I worked for an ITT provider, Teach First, and one of the things that as an ITT provider they were really keen for was a financial pressure in the national system, because actually as soon as you see pressures on the country financially, you start to see a rise in the level of people wanting to engage in teaching, because of the security and the public sector nature. So actually it's an interesting one, and it's definitely one we could take away and look at. But I think what we might see in the system actually over the coming years is more interest in entering the education system because of the associated security. But that's a personal view, not a county one. And I do wonder whether it's something we can take away and get a view on.
And it's also the case as well that if you have a reasonable amount of turnover, and provided the teacher supply is reasonably healthy, then actually your costs can reduce, because you have experienced people who are leaving and you can appoint newly qualified people. That obviously only works if you've got a healthy teacher supply. If you haven't, then of course that all goes very pear-shaped. Certainly over the years we've experienced both sides of that. Any other points that anybody wants to raise about this item at all?
You've got Lynn, Andrew.
Lynn.
Just a quick one about the hidden costs. I think it's predominantly special schools, but it may be in mainstream too, that we have parents who have children with profound and multiple learning difficulties who are also staff. If those children are shielding, we obviously can't afford to keep those staff on full pay, but they are struggling. And what's tending to happen is they're then getting signed off with stress, and we're having to replace them with staffing. So that is a hidden cost that's hitting those schools who've got parents where they can't just find alternative childcare for their child because they've got gastro tubes or complex epilepsy. So I just think we need to be aware of that little cohort.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lynn, for that. Okay. And whilst we've been talking, thank you also, Steve, for your comments supporting the ICT cost issue. Anything else on this item at all?
Just having a look, Andrew. So I think there's a message in the chat that Steve Savers put, and he's just said to enable remote learning to be effective, we will have to invest around £80,000 in the trust.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just a comment he made.
That's what stimulated my last comment. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of costs there. Absolutely. Okay.
Well, that's it as far as I can do. David, could I ask if you lower your hand? That's all. And no one else.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Can we move on to the next?
Andrew, can I ask?
Want to say something?
I do. I just want to. There's a specific question I think that related to this that I was keen to just get a view on. Around those schools that we're currently entering into conversations with, and I guess this is from a maintained school perspective. So, but I guess others will have a view. That we're starting to have those conversations about schools that are at risk of deficit or in deficit. It feels prudent, and to me, to take an approach in that separates the additional costs that we're seeing coming through the system around COVID from those that are a part of the normal running cost of a school and the normal financial position. I.e., if a school was kind of at risk of deficit and is now suddenly got £40,000 worth of additional exceptional costs, obviously we'd look at that. But actually, should we be taking a kind of a view around that to hold fire in terms of looking at recovery of those types of costs until we've got a clearer view of what's happening in the system? I'm just interested in people's views around that, given that it is something that's on the radar right now. What we will see in January is, I guess, a school system that is now forecasting significantly more deficit than it would have been otherwise.
Right. Does anybody want to respond to that, or anybody feel able to respond to that in a way? Amanda, you're on mute, I think.
I'm mute. Yeah, sorry, I did try to raise my hand, but it didn't work. I mean, I know I'm here to represent early years, but I also, work in a school, and I think what you're saying, Phil, is really valid. That from a small school perspective, that even the cleaning costs could put a small school into deficit, let alone any of the IT costs that we've been talking about, supply costs, and all those others. And it does seem really unfair that a school will be penalised maybe next year in their budget and lose staff because of COVID-related costs, rather than that it's not a mismanagement of their budget. They're keeping everybody safe and trying to keep the school open and relevant for all the children. So I think you're right. There needs to be some sort of proviso there to make sure that any school of any size, because bigger schools will have bigger costs, that is taken into account. And again, schools are using up their allocated budgets for other things, for buildings in the future. It seems unfair again that they've had to use that to keep them open because of COVID costs. So I agree with you that it needs to be looked at.
So is this essentially about schools having a very clear separation between COVID costs and their normal running costs, so they can separate out those factors which are exacerbating their deficit, pushing the deficit, which are COVID related, and those other factors which may be having the same effect but which are not COVID related?
Yeah, I think so.
We've got a few hands going up, Andrew. So we did see yours, Amanda, so you can lower yours now. So there's Jackie Phillips first, Lisa Jones, and then Sarah Murphy.
Okay, Jackie?
Thank you. I'd agree with what Amanda and Andrew have both said. I think there should be a recommendation to schools to separately list their COVID costs. So all the excess costs for whatever reason, to be able to identify those and separate them out so that you can see what the picture of the school is like and what the picture of COVID impact is like. And it may be that schools are not necessarily identifying this. I mean, cleaning is a very good example. The cleaning has to be done. Enhanced levels of cleaning are being undertaken, but if it just all gets put in a cleaning budget as opposed to a COVID extra cleaning budget, it's just going to muddy the waters when we're looking at budgets next year. So I think that needs to be a recommendation from the local authority to all schools.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Lisa.
For small schools, what's getting lost here is the fact that they don't have the budget to pay cleaners extra. So what they're actually doing is redeploying existing staff. So children are missing out on small group interventions. They're missing out on that TA time. And maybe we need to ask primary schools, small schools in particular, to record the percentage of time their support staff or even their teaching staff are spending on COVID related tasks as opposed to learning related tasks. Because actually, if you costed that, I think you would have probably double what Phil has had reported to him. And that is effectively what's being stolen from the children.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Sarah.
My point wasn't going to be to what I'm about to say, but yeah, I agree with you, Lisa. Obviously, I see it from the other perspective where I get emails from TAs and teachers saying, should I be a cleaner? So I'm seeing it from the other perspective where people are saying, you know, I'm having to do this cleaning. The point I was going to make was you'll obviously be aware that clinically extremely vulnerable staff are working and teaching from home at the moment for this month. And I should imagine there must be an extra cost on schools when they have to have a support member of staff in the classroom so that that teacher managing the class while the teacher is then teaching remotely from home. So I should imagine that's an impact, quite a significant impact for some schools if they've got a number of clinically extremely vulnerable staff.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Phil, is there anything else you want to pick up on that?
I'd just say that's some really helpful feedback. I think the only thing I would say at the end of the particularly those last points is that in looking at this in kind of the terms of trying to engage with decision makers around whether there's additional funding, it is going to be about the additional costs that are coming through the system rather than the things you're able to manage. And palatable or not, the kind of management of staff around the school to do different tasks, etc., than they might normally do, are things that are going to be hard to evidence as a real cost, as opposed to some of those more material things like the IT, etc. I'm not saying they're not real impacts, but I'm just saying that in terms of lobbying and making that kind of that case, it's harder to do. It's the only thing I'd say.
Okay, thank you.
And Andrew, it's probably worth saying to Phil, are you picking up the comments in the chat as well? Are you seeing some of that? There's a few comments that have come through there. I won't read them all out, but I'm just sort of drawing to your attention.
Sure.
I saw Rachel's comment about the separating them and her teachers are concerned about them not being reimbursed. I think that's a fair point. At this stage, you know, there is, you know, we're doing the right things. I think we're capturing that information and we're making the case for them to be reimbursed. We can't speak for whether that's going to be something that will come. If it doesn't, it's something, again, we can come back to this group to say, how do we address this locally if there isn't a national response?
Yeah. Can I
just come?
Sorry.
It's Rachel Howard here. Can I just come back on that, Phil? I think one of the difficulties in the system, and Sarah's alluded to this, is that people are not spending money on things like supply. They're desperately trying to cover things internally and getting staff to do a whole range of different things because they're worried about the spend because they might not get it back. And that goes for people who've managed to balance their budgets and don't want to go into deficit, and also for people who've got reserves who don't want to spend them because they've got them earmarked for something else. And that's having a massive impact on staff wellbeing and head teacher wellbeing. And I don't think that can be underestimated.
No, and I think that the whole point of this meeting now, this section of the meeting, is to gather that information, and then for the local authority to pass it on as necessary. But also, you know, Phil, as a member of F40, is in a good position to work with them, because F40 is a really powerful organisation in this context, because they have very, very good access to the relevant officers in the DFE. And for example, you know, Tony Foote is very much involved in allocating central funding. So hopefully, if this can feed its way through, then we will find some additional funding will be made available in 2021. But this is the best way we can do that, I think.
Yeah, just to emphasise that point, the last letter which we included in the pack triggered an immediate response from DFE and the funding policy team, and they met with a group from the F40 to discuss the issue. So it is our, I think, our best vehicle directly into that funding team to be able to influence change, not least because it's not just us, it's you know, a whole range of local authorities across the country making the similar points.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Can we now move on to the early years funding? So this follows on from last meeting, and was about the use of reserves to support the costs. Phil, would you like to pick this up? You're on mute, Phil.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to do too many things at once. I'll mute myself. I think Sarah Hilton is with us. Are you there, Sarah?
Yeah, I lost my connection, so I've dialed in. So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I lost my connection completely about 5 minutes ago, so I've dialed in.
Yeah, so Sarah,
go on.
Do you want to introduce yourself then? And
Yeah.
is there some? Do you want to introduce this one and just talk a little bit about it? Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. So I'm Sarah Hilton. I'm the service manager for the early years service in the council. So obviously I know Gwyneth mentioned this at your last meeting, and subsequently I've put that report together. So it's a national issue. This the impact of COVID on early years provision is a national issue, as well as local. I think we have. We mirror really what's happening across the country with what was already quite a fragile market, early years market. Has been further impacted by COVID, with lots of settings being closed, loss of income from fee-paying parents, various different sources of income being reduced. And we have a duty in the local authority, as I'm sure people are aware, around sufficiency. So we have a duty to have sufficient childcare for eligible 2-, 3- and 4-year-olds that's of good quality. And as well as our duty, obviously we're all aware of the impact a good quality early year setting has for children's development, helping them to get ready for school, etc. So really important that we maintain a good cross-section of early years provision across the county for our children. So we were aware both from individual providers contacting us to say they were struggling financially, and also because of looking at national research and national surveys that were being sent to us, that there was a problem emerging, lots of settings reporting that they were at risk of closure due to forecast deficits. So we sent a survey out back in the summer to all of our early years provision, asking them to kind of tell us really about the impact of COVID on their finances and their forecast deficits. And we looked at that then across kind of our sort of comparing that and matching that with sufficiency, and looking at how at risk settings were of closure, so those that were reporting high percentages of loss, and whether if we lost those settings, what the impact would be in terms of sufficiency. We had 260 responses out of just over 700 providers. So over a third of providers responded. And when we did some further analysis looking at those that were reporting quite a high risk of closure, we identified about 36 that were at really high risk that would really impact on sufficiency. And there was a potential, if those settings closed, that we would lose about 800 childcare places at least. Stroud and Cotswolds would have the biggest impact. They potentially could lose 400 childcare places if those settings closed. So what we really needed to look at was how we can support those most at-risk settings. Of course, there may be others, because if one of those most at-risk settings closed, the ones that were slightly less risk would then become a high risk. So there's a sort of knock-on effect really across the whole sector. So we do have a 1.16 million carried forward underspend. So that's kind of what I'm proposing that we use and seeking some agreement from today from you. That we obviously there's a range of options. Last year we shared the whole of the money, whole of our underspend. We shared out between all of our providers and adjusted for deprivation. So we could look at doing that again this year. But what I'm proposing is that we use that money primarily to support sufficiency in the county. So using 400,000 of that money in a pot to look at those settings that are at risk and secure sufficiency, 200,000 in a contingency pot should anything arise between now and the end of the year, and that we, with the remainder of the money, the 560,000, we do the same as we did last year. We allocate that out equally using our kind of formula of the number of claims across all of the other provision. And then should that be agreed, that you've set out in the report kind of a little bit about how we would do that, how we would use that 400,000. And I think it's really important that we would be absolutely, before we considered making any one-off payment to a provider, we would be really looking at their business model, their reported deficit, what position were they in before COVID? You know, is that deficit partly just debts that they were carrying forward? So that we are, not only are we supporting settings that are at risk that would impact on sufficiency, but we're supporting settings that would otherwise be viable, sustainable businesses. And to do that, we would need to engage some additional business support. I only have one member of my team who has the knowledge around business modelling. So we'd look at possibly commissioning a bit of additional support to make sure we really work with those providers to look at, before we issued any money, what position were they in? Could they just look at their current business model and do anything differently to attract more business next year, find other ways of recouping some of those losses, so that we had a really clear picture of settings that really needed the money, had done everything else, claimed all the money that they were eligible for, and then we would look at, once we'd gathered all that data, we would look at what amount of money we would give to what settings. And again, with the focus on ensuring our sufficiency duty. And I've spoken to commissioning who would support us with that piece of work as well. So they would help us, you know, once we had all the data back in, they'd help to come up with some kind of formula of the percentage of each person's sort of confirmed deficit, how we would share that £400,000 out to the sector to ensure sufficiency.
Okay, Sarah?
Okay, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Obviously, we have a recommendation there, but before we consider that, are there any comments from anybody on the forum? Anything that anybody would like to say at all about this?
Just looking, Andrew, to see if we've got anyone with hands up. I can't see any hands raised at the moment.
Okay.
We've now got some. We've got Lynn Dance, and Chris Spencer.
Okay, Lynn, what would you like to?
Well, in support, I just can't reiterate strongly enough the impact of that early intervention for any child, but especially children who are going to be struggling when they get to school without it. I just think we have to do all we can to support that.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Lynn. And Chris.
Yeah, I agree with the previous comment, so I won't repeat that. Early years are critical. What what I think, though, is that this is slightly more complex, and therefore it's not as simple as just supporting provision that's in difficulty. You know, that we have to take a proper strategic look at this, I think, in terms of where the places are and whether they're required, because it's never easy standing by and watching a provider close. But if you do a proper review of provision in an area, there may not be a requirement for that particular provision. And we've experienced that recently over in the Forest with a nursery that the diocese have been supporting up until quite recently, and it's no longer viable. It's created quite a hullabaloo because a sense of loss, but actually if you do this efficiency work, it's not required. All of those children, it looks like at first sight anyway, can be accommodated very close to where that nursery was. So it's just really a word of caution that this is quite a complex exercise to get right. So I don't think we should, what I'm saying is, it sounds incredibly harsh, but I don't think we should be supporting provision which is not viable.
Am I right to think it's a difficult time, in that one of the reasons for this sufficiency support is because of COVID, and is it possible to separate out COVID-related sufficiency difficulties against issues where providers are struggling to survive because actually they don't need to be there? So is that what we're asking to do, or to do things separately?
So again, Andrew, that would be part of the analysis, I think, that you need to do.
Yeah,
right.
If I can come in there, it's Sarah, sorry. Completely agree with Chris. And we would, I know it sounds really harsh, but we would definitely be making sure we were looking at sufficiency. So again, another thing we would look at is if we had a setting that was at risk of closing, and it may not really impact on sufficiency, we might only be really talking about a couple of places rather than investing in keeping a setting open that we might not need. We might be looking at just expanding other provisions in the local area. And again, also, if we've got a setting that is not otherwise viable, so a setting that we know have been struggling for a long time, they were already carrying quite a lot of debt forward. Again, we're not going to invest in a setting that isn't viable. We might then look at, well, if we really need those places, can we increase capacity at other local provision that we know is viable and successful and sustainable moving forward? But that's all of that piece of work that we do between sort of now and the new year, looking at each individual setting.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. That's really helpful. Anything else about early years?
So we've got Amanda Horniman and we've got Gwyneth Keane.
Amanda.
Only to, sorry, I dropped out there, so I missed what Sarah said, but only to say to Chris that we spoke about this at Early Years Forum, and actually, yes, we completely agree that you can't be supporting settings that would have been going under anyway, and that the reason that Sarah's asked for the extra money for business support is to actually so that they can get into those settings and really look at their finances to make sure the money is being well spent on sufficiency, not just to prop up settings that may have had troubles anyway. But again, just like schools, the settings have had even less support. We didn't have any exceptional funds that we could gain from in the autumn term. We couldn't claim for any expenses. And we're relying on a lot on private income coming in, and people are keeping their children at home. So despite the Gloucestershire LA giving us the national funding formula, the funds for the years 3 and 4 year olds and the 2-year-olds, the fees from the parents are missing, and people are really struggling to keep these places open for our youngest children.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Gwyneth. Gwyneth?
Right, sorry, I didn't unmute myself. In support of all of those recommendations, one thing just in response to some of the comments that Chris has made and Sarah around sufficiency is just to be mindful that within our sector, that amount of money is when you divvy it up, is quite a small amount. And I would just be mindful that we don't lose a large portion of it to process rather than on the front line, which can sometimes happen in our sector. We are a very underfunded, low paid sector anyway. And similarly to schools, mental health around staff and providers, especially when they themselves are struggling because of low wages and their own impact on their own lives. Many of our staff aren't paid if they have time off, unlike the public sector. So I just think I'd just like to raise that as a point as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gwyneth. Any other comments about this item? Can we therefore move on to the recommendation, which is that the 1.17 million is distributed according to those 3 bullet points? We're going to do this in a slightly different way from the last meeting. Can I ask if there's anybody who disagrees with that recommendation?
You can raise your hand if you like, or just speak now. That would be sufficient for you, Andrew, wouldn't it?
It would.
I'm not hearing anyone, not seeing anything, hands go up.
Okay, and would anybody want to abstain from a vote on that recommendation?
Not seeing anybody's hand go up or anyone speaking.
Excellent. So in that case, we will say that Schools Forum supports that recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we now move on to high needs? Phil?
Yeah, let me just get myself sorted out again. Right, so the first part of the high needs report is focusing on where we are financially now. So I've included in the report an update on the current financial forecasts, and what we try to do is show there the variance to the budget, but also the variance to the previous reporting period at Schools Forum. So you can see the changes that have been made. Against that, I've kind of outlined the kind of key reasons for movement. This is the first time this financial year where we've had, I think, significant movements around some of these areas. So EHCP college and FE top-ups significantly under the original forecast, now 354k under the budget, and a 400k variance to the last reporting period, 418. Primary EHCP costs also under forecast, and the secondary top-ups slightly over at 246. The other significant movement that you can see there is obviously the special school provision. All of that has really been the work through since the September transition. So we've got clarity over special school placements and all of the transitions between different phases. It is clear, I think, that that in particular the FE position was assuming similar trends to last year. We're actually quite a little way off that this year, so that positive movement's helped to rebalance. The whole position really then shows us as currently forecasting to be 173,000 under the planned budget, which sounds great, but obviously that was set against a budget that was assuming a £5.5 million deficit. So it's against that context. That is a reduced position since the last reporting period, where we were around about 376 under. and so we are starting to see us moving back closer to what we forecast. And I think the note of caution that I would add right now is also that we're starting to see, because the special schools have been commissioned to capacity, we're starting to see some increasing costs in the independent schools, special school placements, which we may well see come through in the next few months up to the January period. But at this moment in time, we're forecasting to be around about 173 under the planned budget. I'll pause there on high needs and just ask if there's any specific questions around the current forecast and the current position.
Anybody wants to ask any questions at all?
Not seeing anything, Andrew.
Okay, Phil, on to the next bit.
Okay, yeah. So as I have been at previous meetings, just updating on some of the key drivers as well, so you can see what's happening in the system. The first one here around permanent exclusion. In the report, we were showing in the September period in line with the previous. This time, effectively last year, there have been 5 permanent exclusions. We have now seen it since the Schools Forum report was produced. We've had the latest data drop effectively for the end of term 1, and we're now in a position where we've had 18 permanent exclusions across the county, which is up on the same period last year. So that's an increase of 7 at the same period. We were at 11 last year. So the table that I've included on this slide, which hopefully has no title thing in the way, but that's effectively showing 4 primary permanent exclusions to date, 13 in secondary, and then 1 from one of the PRUs. So 18 so far this year. So we've seen a slight rise as we've gone into the term, and that is now putting us above where we would have been this point last year. Around the EHCPs, again, in the report, we're showing that the trends have been broadly in line. We are treating this now with a degree of real caution. Again, we're unpicking some of this because this is live data, but at the moment we've seen a 28% rise in requests for EHCP in the most recent reporting period, and that's in comparison to the previous year. So whilst the position has been broadly in line, we're now starting to see a rise in requests, and we're looking at how we can provide support around that, and whether if any of these are linked to, specifically again going back to the point around COVID, if any of these are linked to children and young people struggling to access education on their return from COVID, or whether they're short-term needs, do we need to be entering into that statutory process to be able to support that? Because a 28% rise is obviously a reasonably significant one. Again, you know, I'm providing this as live data. We're reviewing that as we speak to try to get underneath those additional requests and understand what that looks like. But I think there was a kind of message back in June, July, etc., that the impact of COVID would start to see potentially pressures on and rises in permanent exclusion and EHCPs in the system, and we are starting to see some of that coming through in some of the early data. And it is, like I say, you know, this position has changed since I was able to write the report and talking to you today. So you can see that it's really live information. I don't know whether there's any questions around that specifically.
Got Richard Boyles, Andrew, and Becky Martin.
Okay, Richard.
Yeah, Phil. can you tell us the EHCP rise? Is there any particular school or area locality that we can tie this down to, or is it spread equally across the whole of the county, as it were?
Yeah, like I say, it's really early data, so I'm picking it. It looks like it's spread across the county. It doesn't look like it's around a particular school or locality, but that is very early emerging information. So we are reviewing that to really understand it. Like I say, trying to see if there are alternatives for us to provide support, particularly given the pressures on and timescales associated to accessing an education health and care plan as well.
Righty-ho. When you've done that, I'd be really interested to talk that through with yourself and Chris Spencer. Thanks very much.
Yeah, of course. Lovely.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. And Becky Martin. Becky.
Hello, Phil.
Yeah.
What work's being done with the local authority at Shire Hall regarding actually getting EHCPs done quicker? Because it worries me that this data is not up to date at all, because requests for EHCPs can take months and months to go through. And in terms of annual reviews of EHCPs, you can be talking 12 months at least for the documents to come back. So I worry that this data is not accurate anyway.
Not accurate in what sense? So these were specifically around requests for. So at that point they would be registered. So the process and the timescale would kick in. And my understanding is that in terms of meeting the statutory timescales around issuing, from point of agreement to assess, that we're still hitting those pretty well compared to our national comparators. But I'm happy to share some information around that. I think we have a good deal of confidence around the actual data in terms of the numbers of plans that are coming through the system. The timescales are something from the point of agreement to assess. I don't have the specific number to hand, but are very high and actually above those to our comparator local authorities. So is it the point around agreeing to assess? Is that where you're seeing the lag or concern?
I think the point is that I read the high needs report, which is excellent, and it talks about, and you talked earlier about joined up conversations and multi-agents working, and all of these really good key points. And yet when a child needs an EHCP, from that point onwards and every annual review onwards, the delays, and I'm really happy to look at the data with you if I'm wrong, but from personal experience and from experience within my school where I'm chair of governors, it's very, very slow. So I don't believe that the needs of individual pupils are necessarily up to date in terms of any pupil with an EHCP.
Thank you, Becky. I guess that partly takes us on to ask the question as to whether for all children an EHCP is the most efficient way of getting them the additional support that they need, perhaps. I don't know.
Andrew, you've got Chris Spencer as well.
Chris.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute on this health and education care plans data. I mean, if that were achievement outcome data or a comparison between different ethnic groups, I think we'd be asking ourselves some very serious equality questions. If you've got that proportion of boys compared to girls, are we neglecting girls or are we highlighting the problems that boys have, and what is the system doing to accommodate that? You know, if you could almost make that data a public sector equality duty issue, if you look at it, because it's so starkly discrepant, isn't it? That you have that number of boys compared to girls. I think that's a real issue, and it's only just come to me, and I've read this report a couple of times. So just looking at it again, it's just so strikingly different, and I think that should raise some real warning bells in our minds about whether that's appropriate or not, and raise questions really that you've just highlighted, Andrew, about whether the system is fit for purpose. I've got serious doubts about that personally, and I do think in a lot of cases EHCPs is a process, and rather than an intervention, and it often is the case that the chair of governance quite rightly raises the issue, but it's quite common that we will hear a lot from a school about a child until they've got an EHCP, and then they seem to move on to the next child in order to process that one, and you very rarely hear then about that child again in terms of its support for learning. So slightly controversial, but I think they're important questions, and I think you raise a good challenge about whether the system is right.
I absolutely agree with you, Chris, about that discrepancy between boys and girls. At the very, very least, it needs some kind of analysis to understand why that is. I mean, you can make all kinds of assumptions, but I think that's probably dangerous. But it definitely needs unpicking. Anything else about this before we move on to the JHNTP?
Got a few other people, Andrew, that have just come out. Lynn Dance and David Metcalf.
Okay, Lynn.
Just a quick point that's a national trend. Special schools are traditionally, in the 40 years I've been doing it, been a ratio of 75% boys, 25% girls. There is an awful lot of research on why that is, and still some going on. And there's been an awful lot of really good work in the last 5 years about girls with autism and Asperger's not getting diagnosed. So I think it would be good to look at, and I'd happily look at that with on a working party. Thank you.
It would be quite interesting if any of that current research is reasonably accessible. If some links or signposting towards that could be made available, because it is, I think, really interesting.
I'll make myself a note, and when I get a chance, I'll try and put something together and send it
That'd be
to
great.
for distribution.
Okay, thank you. And David.
Phil, just a very quick one. I know the data's obviously just come in recently. Do you know the sort of the breakdown of the areas for the requests in terms of SEMH, communication and language? Are we seeing a rise in a particular area, or is it just across the board?
I don't have that information for you right now. I think as an output from this, as soon as we got that live information, I will get it shared around so that people can start to see a little bit more about that, the kind of the spread behind that. I think the reason for including that now was a note of caution, I guess, around the financial situation. And I take a lot of the points around the process and the operating models to support this. There are things, as we'll go on to, I guess, on the Joint Additional Needs High Needs Programme that we're looking to do around this area. But I guess the point for this group in raising these two areas specifically is more about the kind of potential financial impact to high needs moving forward.
Okay. Anything else about this? Okay. Right, can we move on then to the Joint Additional Needs and High Needs Transformation Programme?
It's fancy, isn't it, that title?
It sounds great.
I know.
Pity it doesn't make a word. Never mind. Probably
next
just
time.
as well.
next time.
Okay, please.
So just a couple of updates. So one of the actions from the last meeting was to follow up on the 3 areas that we said we would look at. I just wanted to provide an update on where we were with the 3. The advisory teacher service have spoken to the team, and they are starting to look at some options around that. Obviously, it's a relatively big piece of work, and the aim there is to bring something back to the forum in the June forum, at the point the high needs budget is going through, to be able to outline some recommendations there. And I think, given where we are, that is likely to be focused on potential in-year savings rather than setting a budget saving, if that makes sense. So setting the budget and then looking at how we might improve on that throughout the year. Second point around diseconomy of scale, I've met with Lynn and Pete as reps from GASH already on this, and I'm going to see the special school heads in late November to work that one through, and we'll come back to the forum January with that. The one in 40, we have started to do some modelling work around this to look at alternatives, and I think we're at a stage where we want to kick the working group into action as a forum working group to start to look at this. I am someone that likes things to be as simple as they can be in life. This is not one of those things that is achievable. So, some early modelling, looking at the additional needs factors in the national funding formula and comparing that to the 1 in 40 gives us quite a big variance in terms of the funding that might go to individual schools compared to what they're receiving now and what they might receive moving forward. So Neil has done some really good work on this to start looking at it, and I think it's right now, before we start progressing any further with that, to get the working group to start to look at some of those options and explore that to make sure that we're taking that in the right direction. So I will, following this meeting, kind of put out a call for anybody that would like to be a part of that to start to look at some of the early modelling and come up with a solution around that. Andrew, I'm just going to stop there, see if there's any questions about those three.
Not seeing anything, Andrew.
No. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Then the final bit I've shared in the update, I've provided the kind of joint additional needs, high needs transformation program. There's a highlight report there, which is kind of what we're using to update the governance around this as to show progress in any of those areas. I'm happy to take any questions or specific feedback around anything that's in that, if anybody wants to raise anything. I think the key thing that's coming forward now, moving forward, is the EHCP funding, and it links back to the conversation that we were just having. We are ready, really, for some engagement around a proposed way forward on this. So I provided a link to the engagement pack in the report. And I also put in put in a diagram, which I'm going to try and now cleverly, hoping this is coming onto your screen as we speak. Yes. To show what we're proposing to do here. And I think it's worth being, because there's two clear purposes to this. One, I think, is to try to create some clarity and consistency in the way that we're funding SEN across and additional needs across the system. At the moment, a lot of there are a number of different ways to access and models for accessing additional funding. There are individual top-ups into FE college, primary, secondary, etc., which is separate from the special school banding structure. And then there are different models for supporting CNI centres and alternative provision, etc. So we've got a range of different things going on in the system, which is complex, and as I guess has been built up over time. So there's a kind of consistency element to this, but there's also an aim to, as we've said before, move ourselves away from this idea that the only way to access additional support from high needs is to enter into the statutory process. So what in the diagram, what that's kind of trying to show is the current effectively funding system, the way that funding broadly operates at the moment. So you've got the universal offer at the bottom, notional SEN funding, and then within the mainstream you've got these individually scored and funded EHCPs. It's fair to say the RAS system we're not proposing to change the RAS system. That individual scoring will still continue. It's the individual funded bit that we're looking at there. And then it moves up into the kind of specialist areas where you've got alternative provision, which is funded slightly differently, and then a banding system that operates through special schools. And then right at the top, it's showing the individually costed provision for independent and mainstream. When I created this diagram, I was also trying to show the kind of access point here. So you've got the EHCP down the left, which is basically showing at the point you've gone beyond notional SEM funding, really what you're doing is accessing an EHCP to progress through that. On the right-hand side of that diagram, what we're trying to show is the proposed way forward. And we've still got universal and notional down here, but actually what we're proposing is this common banding system that operates. And I think, you know, we've created a linear point here between mainstream and specialist. I don't think that is quite as blunt as that. It's not a midway through band 2 or band 2 is the point where you might be accessing specialist or mainstream. It's just an attempt to articulate that this is working across the whole system. So the aim is to implement a common banding system that works across, creates that consistency, is focused around the child's needs, not the provision they're in. So alongside the system and in the pack, that if you went online and looked at the engagement pack, there are descriptors against the 4 main areas of need in the code of practice, CNI, etc., SEMH. Very clear descriptors that we want to take feedback on against each of those bands, so that we're able to really clearly articulate the type and level of need that band is intended to support, with a view to having a common system that works across the piece, that isn't, as you can see on the left-hand side where we're trying to show the graduated pathway, My Plan Plus EHCP, that isn't linked to the statutory process, that actually we're only engaging in the statutory process for an education health and care plan where it is necessary to do so, that additional needs in school that go above and beyond what notional SEM funding is there to support can be supported through the graduated pathway. We don't have to enter into the statutory process to do that. Now, you know, there's a number of reasons to do that, not least that some of the issues that Becky raised earlier about speed and access to support can certainly come through the system and will be a benefit if we're able to operate this system. So what we've done is laid that out. I guess what we're aiming for here is that degree of consistency, but that also that key point around making sure that we're not directing everybody above and beyond notional funding to that statutory process. The next steps around this, is that it's out for engagement now. We really do need high quality feedback around those descriptors. They're really critical for making sure that the banding system operates properly. We're engaging with heads associations. I think Lisa's agreed to lead a group from the Primary Heads Association to look at this and respond, etc. So we need that engagement around the descriptors so that we can then take the next steps on this, which will come back to forum. And I think, again, probably that working group that will set up as well to look at provision maps against those descriptors and what the funding and the costings and the band are associated to those banding based on a very clear provision map, which won't necessarily and wouldn't be linked to the kind of TA hours, teaching assistant hours that we've had previously, although, you know, obviously we will cost the teaching assistant hours, but it will be about what the provision is that's needed to support. So that's my kind of potted summary of where that is. I'd be really interested if there's any feedback around. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see people. I'd be really interested if there's any feedback around the highlight report and the Joint Dictionaries programme, but more importantly, I think at this stage, the proposed move to a common banding system.
Would anybody like to ask any questions, make any points at all?
Just looking, Andrew, nobody up at the moment indicating.
Can I ask a question?
You can, Andrew.
Thank you. I need a clarification first, having been out of the system, as it were, for 18 months. Is it still the case that EHCPs are created for fairly small tariff In other words, what would have been perhaps 5 or 6 hours of TA support, or £3,000 or £4,000. Do they still exist? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, there are very small allocations of funding associated to some. Yeah.
Which takes me on to my question in that case, because if you have a child who has an EHCP for where the value on it, shall we say, is £3,000 or £4,000, then unless you're receiving 1 in 40 funding as a school, you'll get no funding because it'll be below the £6,000 threshold. Yeah. But with what's being suggested in the stakeholder engagement pack, what that would indicate in the solution, that if a school identifies a child who needs extra support, which is beyond that which they would be expected to fund from the notional SEN funding, then some funding could be made available. So therefore, am I right in thinking that this process would mean that a child with significant but not high tariff needs, that as a school, some funding could be made available, which would not be available if you had an EHCP? Does that make sense?
I think it does. There was a very technical one. I think I followed it. I think what we're not looking to do here is necessarily. I think what we have said consistently across the system is we know there's a rising level of need across the system. What we can't obviously afford to do is to start to look to fund more. So at levels that we wouldn't have been doing so previously, what we are looking to do is unlock that funding from the statutory process. We're not looking to lower any thresholds around this because we just couldn't literally afford to do. As much as we would love to, we couldn't afford to do that. So the thresholds need to stay the same. The point here, I think, is about having access to this outside of, and if we can start to do that, it releases a number of other pressures in the system linked to the statutory process, which I think it places on all stakeholders in the system, because it's a statutory process. There's a lot of work that goes into that from the school side, from our side, etc. So there are benefits that side, but it isn't about necessarily lowering that threshold, if that was what you were kind of asking.
It was double-edged, really, I suppose, what I was asking. One would be that if what I was describing was the case, then it would mean that the incentive to go for an EHCP would be reduced, which would perhaps reduce the number of EHCPs. And obviously the process of setting up an EHCP is hugely expensive, which would release funds that actually could be used to support children's education as opposed to a horribly bureaucratic process. But the other thing is, I guess, suppose some clarity as to, how this works. So, I mean, it says here that children have additional needs but don't need an AHCP will be able to access funding, and it's how those two play with each other, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think the clarity around the thresholds and the gateway. So, one of the things that I've asked the team who are leading on this, is specialist commissioning, to look at is the descriptor around the notional SEN funding, because we've actually got now descriptors against the bands, but actually we're missing that notional bit, which is then looking at creating that. And I think one of the questions when you look, and if you go through the process for the engagement, one of the questions is about, does the progression in this feel right? Does this feel like it's progressing through the level of need in the system in the right way?
Right. Okay.
So Andrew,
questions or points?
I can see Kirsten's got her hand up physically.
And Becky? Okay,
so we've got Kirsten Harrison, and we've got Becky Martin.
Okay, Kirsten.
Thank you, Andrew. Sorry, I did put my hand up on the special machine, but it hasn't registered it. Can I ask about the kind of communication, and you're asking for a sort of high quality feedback around this in terms of how you are engaging those associations and ensuring that people get to grips with them. And I've read my way through all of the documentation. There are a lot of interesting questions, not quite perhaps as technical as the one that Andrew's just proposed, but around how it might work. And there's parts of it that look like that would be beneficial. But in terms of ensuring that for example, the secondary heads are aware of it, know how to find it. I mean, I've tried to engage in some conversations with colleagues around it, and they are not aware. And I'm conscious that there were some sort of false start communication issues around the talc launch, which was, it was all ironed out. But it's always very difficult to get good quality feedback from people if they're not aware of the consultation or given the right channels and prompts to engage with it. So I'm just asking really what your game plan is around ensuring that you get the feedback that is necessary for this.
Yeah. So this is a really good point. So when I spoke to the Primary Heads Association, I think that's where Lisa. I'm right in saying it is you, Lisa, isn't it? I'm looking at for nodding. So the primary heads had a conversation about this when met with them, and the idea was to get a group together to start to look at that. And actually, we would, when I say we, the people that have been working on this, come and be able to talk it through, answer questions, and support that process. And we would like, I think I did touch on this when I came to see Gash, though I'm very conscious I said quite a lot in a short period of time in that we would like to do the same for the Secondary Heads Association as well. And I know that Tracy is engaging with the Special School Heads Association around it. So we do want to get collectively groups together to look at this, and we can be in touch around that. Obviously, that's not to stop anybody that has an interest in submitting their own individually as well.
I just think that there's so much here to sort of process, and people have had experience of banding systems in other authorities, and it's drawing on some of that good practice. But actually, if you're talking to colleagues who've come across from different authorities, actually they can say, well, this is how it actually worked in practice. That broader canvas of discussion, I think, would be extremely valuable, and therefore the communication process, the timeline, the mechanisms for feeding back are important. I mean, the engagement pack, whilst all there, it's quite difficult to get into and process. No. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm really keen that it gets the discussion and the airing, and particularly the awareness among colleagues at this sort of developmental stage, so that the sector has full buy-in to it and feels that they are doing it with the local authority and not having it done to them, which is never going to be the intention, but might be the outcome.
Yeah, 100%. And I understand that. I understand the points about accessing it. I did go through that one a couple of times to try to make it more accessible, believe it or not. And I think the reason for setting up groups to look at this, and I think that was outlined somewhere in the pack. If not, I can circulate the details of some of the groups that are starting to look at Sendias, etc. Was that we did recognise that it needed, a conversation to really get good engagement around this, not just sending something over on an email link.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Becky.
Yes, on the proposed new scale picture, obviously EHCPs are being removed and My Plan Plus is put in for the lower needs children. Who's writing the My Plans?
So we're not intending to change the graduate pathway process at all. So the process, in terms of the way it operates at the moment, is in operation, and there's no, as I understand it, no need to change the way those plans are created. Obviously, not as part of the funding system. I think if there's a reason to review the way that operates because it's not operating correctly, then that's a separate matter. But it isn't necessarily linked to the way that the funding model is created. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, no, it does. It's just what it suggests is that you're looking at more My Plans and less EHCPs. That's what it looks like.
I mean, if we're using the graduated pathway properly, then no, is the short answer to that. We should be using the graduated pathway anyway. And if a child's in need of support through an EHCP, then we should have been going through that process, the graduate pathway anyway. So effectively what we're trying to do is prevent that progression into the statutory process if it's just to access funding. And I stress that point. This isn't about stopping anybody accessing any HCP that needs to access any HCP, but it was so we may see more plans, more my plan pluses in the system. But if we do, it'll be linked to a reduction in the number of EHCPs. So it's not about more plans, shouldn't be.
I think my worry is if the my plan plus are being written by social workers, trying to get hold of a social worker at the moment is incredibly difficult. And I don't mean to keep throwing these negative things out, but it's all well and good having these new systems. But if there's not the people there to do them in the first place, that is what I'm worried about. So the EHCP system is very slow, which we've already discussed, but the social services element of getting a My Plan or a My Plan Plus written for a child, trying to get hold of a social worker is very difficult. Or are you suggesting that other people would be able to write these plans?
Can I say here?
Yeah.
I've never known a social worker write a My Plan or a My Plan Plus. They're written by teachers.
That was my understanding as well.
Yeah, My Plans are written by teachers. My Plan Plus are supposed to be written by, it can be anybody who takes the lead from a team around the child from different agencies, but it's teachers usually, at least 9 times out of 10.
Hey, we have enough trouble getting the knitting done as it is, let alone social workers taking that on. Thank you. We'll give that one a miss.
Thank you.
I don't
Claire,
have the capacity.
sorry.
Occasionally they'll incorporate some targets off My Plans if they cross over a little bit, but it's generally sits in education.
Okay, thank you very much. Claire, you've been keen to contribute or to ask a question. You're on mute at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Going back to Becky's comment about the My Plan Pluses, I think in special schools there is a different system. I mean, because of course all our children have got EHCPs. So when we're looking at My Plan Pluses, it is very much about us getting the social care involvement. So we do have lead professionals for our My Plan Pluses. So some of our children will have an EHCP and they'll have a My Plan Plus. So I think there is a difference between special and the mainstream. In terms of the comments that Becky also made about writing the My Plan Pluses, I mean, I'm assuming that if the My Plan Plus is going to have funding attached to it, then it is going to have to be written to a certain level and quality, and it is still going to have to require the same level of assessment in terms of engaging EPs or advisory teachers to support that. So there will be some savings, and there will be some differences. They won't end up with an EHCP, but I'm assuming that the assessment process will still be pretty rigorous. Phil?
Yeah, 100%. I think the assessment process needs to be appropriate, doesn't it? Whatever the plan is, whether it's My Plan Plus, or any EHCP, the quality and rigor around the assessment is critical. So we're not proposing that by doing this that we would be reducing the inputs and the quality of assessment that's required, by making sure it's right for the individual child. Yeah.
Can I just say, to me it almost sounds as if we're going full circle. When I was a Senko many years ago, we used to have school action, and we'd have school action plus, and we would do all the paperwork, and then we would go to an annual audit with the local authority, and we would have to present our cases, and they would be looked at, and they would either be agreed or not agreed, and you got funding based on that. To me, it sounds as if that could be a similar sort of approach that we're moving towards. That was incredibly stressful for the staff, because I also managed the process when I was an SEN advisor, and those Senkos that were then responsible for producing the documentation and trying to get it through those audits, and of course if they didn't, their school didn't get the money for those particular children. So as I said, it sounds a little bit like that. The other thing I wanted to mention from a special school angle is that in terms of the new funding model, you'll be reducing us down from 5 bands to possibly 2, possibly 4. So obviously that's something that we would be wanting to look at. And of course, even now, between the different special schools, the different types of special schools, you know, the criteria, it's very difficult to get criteria in the different areas of need that will match all the different settings that you've got.
Yeah.
I mean, Phil, in terms of involvement of special schools, I know that you will be and are working with us, but in terms of going through all of this, is there a plan for you? You said at the end of November, you're coming to the Zoom meeting?
We're coming to, yeah, I was going to say we're coming to the next meeting. We're seeing our houses and coming to the next meeting. Tracy and I are coming to talk through some of that. I think, you know, the proposed number of bands, etc. You know, it may be that we need to put another band in there. That isn't specifically an issue if you feel the progression between the existing ones that have been developed are right. And I would say that those have been developed in partnership with a range of different stakeholders from across the system. So there's been special school involvement in that, and Senkos, etc., from mainstream, just in that early part, so that there was a view. But yeah, happy to do that. And I think what we know will come up is that the complexity between a primary and secondary need for children, if we're effectively associating a band to SEMH, for example, and there's a secondary need, that may create some complexity. So we need to work those things through. You know, common banding systems are common. There's quite a lot of local authorities operating this. We've looked at quite a few in terms of developing this work, so they can operate well. And the feedback we've had from schools and from local authorities that are operating is they can, but it is obviously all in the operating model that you put behind it. It needs to work, and it needs to work, and we need to spend the time to get that right now.
Any other questions or points anybody would like to make?
I can't see anyone else, Andrew.
Claire's got a hand.
Oh, Claire Steele.
Yeah, it's only a quick point. It almost looks like you're going to move to a place where actually, when you get an EHCP, you also probably hit the criteria for special school.
Possibly, but that's not an intent.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any other questions or comments about this at all? Okay.
I think Gwyneth's got a hand.
Gwyneth.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Hello, sorry. I just wanted to just come into what Claire was saying about EHCP, and just from an early years point of view, and just speaking from my own experience, the level of EHCPs over the last few years has risen considerably. I think sometimes it's because I think Steve touched on this some time ago, when you have a good track record with SEND, you get quite a high volume parental recommendation. I think the impact on us as a sector is where there's a lack of spaces in special schools. I have such a significant rise in children deferring now and not going into school because they have an EHCP with me, in particular children with autism, that they are deferring because they're waiting a place. So it's beginning to come back all the way back down to early years. I've got 5 children that have deferred over my 3 settings that have deferred this year. They all have EHCPs, all are autistic, and all are awaiting places. So I just kind of thought I'd highlight that. And also from us now, we're having it where the educational psychologists are saying that due to the significant volume of work, they can take no more referrals. I had that this week and last week, and so can only offer generic advice when I'm asking for a child who is displaying, because I can't make that diagnosis, but is displaying at the age of 2 or 3 significant concerns on that spectrum. So I just thought we were talking about places, and I'd bring that in from our sector as well. I hope that's relevant.
Okay, thank you, Gwyneth. Thank you very much. Okay. anything else about high needs anybody wants to?
No one with hands up now, Andrew.
Okay, all right. Well, that takes us to the end of the last item on the agenda, and therefore, at just before 10 to 4, and before 4 o'clock for a change, we can draw the meeting to a close, and look forward to seeing you virtually, I presume, on the 14th of January for the next meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.